At the outset, Butts said that he agreed that vouchers, tax credits, and so forth probably were more efficient. That is, you probably could get better education in a technical sense for less cost. He then went on to say, but what makes you think that the public school system ever was concerned with matters of efficiency and simply teaching kids to read and write and learn? He said the reason the public schools were established had very little to do with those purposes. They were established for social and political reasons. They were established for the purpose of what Butts calls teaching civic virtue, civic education. He went on to say that were we to have a free market in education, you would have a pluralism of systems. You would have perhaps the Ku Klux Klan teaching bigotry to their children. You would perhaps have other racists or other anti-Semitic groups teaching bad values to their children. He said the reason that the common school system, as they called it in the 19th century, was established was to give Americans a certain cultural homogeneity, to impose on American children a certain common set of values. Now, Butts is absolutely correct in this observation. Anyone who knows anything about the history of the American state school system clearly understands that the debate in the 19th century in America between those who were favoring an elaborate state school system and those who favored either none at all or perhaps one very minimal, the debate did not center on whether the private school or the free market could teach kids literacy skills, because it was clear that there was a high degree of literacy. The literature of the 19th century in America, in France, and in England does not concern matters of we have to teach the poor kids to read and write. That barely occurs in the literature at all, if ever. The debates concern things like, what about these Irish Catholic immigrants who are coming over to America? How will they become good Protestants and good Americans? Later in the 19th century, they concerned Eastern European immigrants. There was a good deal of racism. The major purpose, to put it very simply, and I'll be going into more detail on this in a second, was to what they call, one of the major purposes was to Americanize the immigrants. Another term they used very commonly was we must Christianize the Catholics. Now, this may sound somewhat funny to you. Well, I think I've just converted Marshall to a proponent of the state school system. What I'm getting at in general is that in any country one cares to look at, and the three that I'll be touching on briefly will be France, England, and the United States, the debates were over political and social issues. They were not over whether the free market could provide adequate education in a strict sense of teaching basic literacy skills, teaching various disciplines. Now, let me also distinguish between education and schooling. Education is any general process by which one person transmits values, ideas, principles, whatever, to another person. Education clearly can occur in an institutional framework, or it can occur outside of an institutional framework. It can occur with computers, television, radio, books, or in a formal setting, such as in a school. In an institutionalized context, when education occurs, we call it schooling. So the debate in the 19th century in America about education concerned not just education, but the institutional question of whether it should be in schools organized and run and regulated to some extent by the government. Now, this brings me to the major theoretical point I wish to make, and the reason that I called the talk why the state education system is a success. In order to judge whether a given institution is a success or a failure, one must judge by the standard of for what purpose was that institution established. We cannot say whether a given institution is good or bad, or whether it's been successful or unsuccessful, unless we know what the people had in mind when they established it. Now, if you assume, as do many libertarians, that the people who established the state educational system in America wanted to achieve a high degree of skill and literacy and such, then you might say the school system has been a failure. But as I pointed out, that was not at least the primary purpose. The primary purpose was to safeguard the government against too much radicalism, against dangerous subversives, against certain values that they thought were dangerous to American society. The ideal of the common school system was kind of a citizenry that would have much in common, that wouldn't be very there would be kind of a gray uniformity about it, a kind of an Orwellian uniformity. Of course, they didn't put it in those terms, but that was the clear implication. And I would say, judged by those standards, the school system has been an astonishing success, because that is the sort of product that typically comes out of the state school system in America. Now, there's another very important point that I think libertarians should take heed of. If you're going to argue effectively about free market versus state education, you're going to have to educate yourself to some extent in the history of the controversy. Now, this problem of libertarians educating themselves is not obviously confined just to the subject of state education. We are a relatively small movement, and although it's not necessary for every member of the libertarian movement to become a scholar, that's highly unrealistic, it is necessary for most members of the libertarian movement to be extremely well educated in a number of different areas, do a lot of reading. One of those areas you should read in if you're interested in education is the history of education. A very common misconception, even among libertarians, is this. Some people believe that the idea of state education is relatively new, that because of a certain humanitarian wave or altruistic wave in the mid-19th century, suddenly this idea of, well, let's help kids out by giving them free education financed by tax revenues and so forth. The point I want to make historically, and I'll be spending the remainder of my time on this, is the following. State education is, the idea of state education is extremely ancient. It goes all through ancient Greek philosophy, it goes through European philosophy throughout the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, and into the modern period. State education has, the idea of state education, whether it's in the form of a formal government or a state church or some other political body, has always been the norm, so to speak. The really remarkable thing, the unusual thing, has been the idea of free market education, which has received relatively little support in Western European history throughout the years. Now, for those of you who engage in arguments, if you ever hear the argument, well, to the effect of, well, give me an example of a purely free market educational system and something we can compare it to, we have an excellent historical example, an excellent historical model. If you go back to ancient Greece, around, say, the 5th century BC, you have two cities that are extremely well known. One is Athens, the other is Sparta. Now, when I say the word Athens to you, what do you think of? Well, a lot of people think of great achievements in literature, in art, and particularly in philosophy. They think of Athenian democracy. They think of the age of Pericles. They think of the great philosophers. When I say the word Sparta, what do you think of? You think of an extremely militaristic, repressive society. Can you name one philosopher, one artist, one literary figure who hailed from Sparta? Sparta had no culture in any real sense. It was an extremely totalitarian culture. What was Sparta known for? And it was also known historically for its state educational system. The Spartan system was taken throughout European history as a model by many, many advocates of state schooling, including American advocates of state schooling. Even someone like Samuel Adams, in his dream for what he called a Christian Sparta, used the Spartan model as a precedent to argue for the necessity of state education. One of the great tragedies in Western philosophy is that the two most noted philosophers of ancient Greece, Plato and Aristotle, although both of them resided in or around Athens, both of them rejected the Athenian free market system of education and favored the Spartan system instead. This was to have a profound influence all throughout European history up to the present day, because Plato and Aristotle, as you know, had an enormous impact on the thinking of philosophers, and particularly in the area of education. Now, I must clarify a bit. When Plato and Aristotle said they admired the Spartan system, they didn't mean they admired the militaristic values that were taught by Sparta. What they admired was the rigor and the discipline, and they wished to see the Spartan system used but with Athenian values. That is, they didn't want a pure military state, but they thought the Spartans were much more effective in educating their children. One of the reasons for this was that when Plato was a young man, the Peloponnesian Wars had just ended, and Sparta had defeated Athens in those wars, and Plato believed that much of the reason for this was that the Athenian democracy had become corrupt. Now, when I talk about a pure model of free market education, 5th century Athens is a perfect example. There were no regulations whatever in 5th century Athens. The market was totally open in education. Now let me give you, now I'm going to be going into some history here, and I'll be giving you a number of quotations. Let me say the reason that I'm using the quotations is not to bore you with quotations. I think you'll find most of them interesting and most of them are rather brief. But because frankly, when I get into some of this material, if I were to paraphrase it, you would not believe me. When I start reading to you some of the reasons that the prominent state educators in America gave for a state system of education, if I were to paraphrase it, you'd probably think, well, I'm giving a rather unsympathetic slant. What did the person really say? That is the reason in many cases I'm going to give you direct quotation from the mouth of the horse, so to speak. Let's go back to Athens during the 5th century BC, during the time of Socrates. There is a Socratic dialogue which Plato wrote, in which a man named Hippocrates approaches the philosopher Socrates, and he's very excited, and he says, look, we have to go over, because Protagoras, a man named Protagoras, who's one of the best known of the sophists, is in town, and this man, Hippocrates, wanted to pay this famous teacher of wisdom, that's what the term sophist means, for his services. At this point, Socrates in this dialogue cautions his friend. He said, a sophist is an educational entrepreneur, quote, a merchant or peddler of the goods by which the soul is nourished, that is, education. Plato's Socrates then articulates what is probably the first argument against free market education in the history of Western civilization, and I'm going to give it right from the dialogue. This is what he says, quote, we must see that the sophist, in commending his wares, now remember, the sophists have a very bad reputation. The term sophistry, as we know today, has a bad word. But the sophists were basically free market teachers. They were itinerant teachers that traveled from city to city, selling their educational services to whoever wished to buy them. And this is why, listen to why Plato, using Socrates as a mouthpiece, disliked the sophists. We must see that the sophist, in commending his wares, does not deceive us, like the wholesaler and the retailer who deal in food for the body, in other words, like merchants. These people do not know themselves which of the wares they offer is good or bad for the body, but in selling them praise them all. In other words, they advertise. And those who buy from them don't know either unless one of them happens to be a trainer or a doctor, in other words, an expert in this area. So too, those who take the various subjects of knowledge from city to city and offer them for sale retail to whoever wants them, commend everything that they have for sale, but it may be, my dear Hippocrates, that some of these men are also ignorant of the beneficial or harmful effects on the soul of what they have for sale. And so too are those who buy from them, unless one of them happens to be a physician of the soul, in other words, an expert in the area of education. If then you chance to be an expert in discerning which of them is good or bad, it is safe for you to buy knowledge from Protagoras or anyone else. But if not, take care you don't find yourself gambling dangerously with all that is dearest to you. Indeed, the risk you run in purchasing knowledge is much greater than in buying provisions, close quote. This is an explicit argument against free market education based on the idea that individuals are not sufficient judges of quality education and you need experts. This is an argument that many later proponents of state education were to use. For example, John Stuart Mill in the middle of the 19th century. Now, I want to turn for a moment and talk a little bit more about the Spartan model and Plato and Aristotle's admiration for it. As I said, Plato and Aristotle were by no means unqualified admirers of Sparta, but they did admire the state system of education. Plato, in his blueprint of an authoritarian society, The Republic, his most famous work, advocates a state system of centralized education under the supervision of a minister of education. He says, in the words of a prominent history of Greek philosophy, Ernest Barker, in this conception, Plato was definitely and consciously departing from the practice of Athens and setting his face towards Sparta. Plato's aim, the scholar continues, was to combine the curriculum of Athens with the organization of Sparta. Now, Plato's view of the relationship between the child and the state reflects the Spartan influence. Here is a quote from Plato. Education is, if possible, to be, as the phrase goes, compulsory for every mother's son, on the ground that the child is even more the property of the state than of his parents. Close quote. Now, this theme that the child is primarily the property of the state was to become the major theoretical or moral argument for state education. It was an argument that Aristotle used as well, although he did not want as an authoritarian system of education as did Plato. Nevertheless, Aristotle said, quote, "The citizen should be molded to suit the form of government under which he lives, which means that education should be one and the same for all," close quote. Aristotle went on to criticize the laissez-faire free market education of Athens, where, as he put it, everyone looks after his own child separately and gives them separate instruction of the sort which he thinks best, close quote. And he then went on to praise the Spartan model instead. And here's how he put it. "Neither must we suppose that any one of the citizens belongs to himself, for they all belong to the state, and are each of them a part of the state. And the care of each part is inseparable from the care of the whole. In this particular, as in some others, the Spartans are to be praised, for they take the greatest pains about their children and make education the business of the state," close quote. Now, I cannot go through in any kind of detail the transmission of Plato and Aristotle's views in European culture. To put it very briefly, around the 12th century, Aristotle's writings are rediscovered. Some centuries later, the writings of Plato become known in their full texts. And the idea of the Spartan model of education becomes extremely popular due to the enormous influence of these two philosophers. And European philosophers as early as the 16th century start talking about the need for a system of state education.